Hello. If you're new here, my name is Tara. I'm an artist and a creative coach. What I'd like to do today is, well, actually, what I'm currently doing is making myself a coffee, because where would creative work be without caffeine? Do you know, there is a whole theory that the Renaissance period happened because of caffeine, or the discovery of, I think, the coffee bean. It must be true. I heard it on the internet. Anyway, so what I'm doing today is I have done an illustration of a very snazzy green tiger. The task I have to achieve is now taking that tiger and putting that tiger into a whole bunch of different outputs. So, you know, I create all these different versions of PNG files with a background, without a background, an outline, a shadow, etc., etc. And then I'll create extended designs with, you know, beautiful painterly style backgrounds. And the reason I'm doing that is essentially I have a system. Since I've been creating illustrations and putting them on products, which is part of what I'm doing as one of the aspects of my creative outputs, my business, I put illustrations on products. So here's a little example, a keychain of a froggy design, and that same design, but with a whole extended background. I have to have a system. You know, I can't just do one illustration and it's going to work for every single output. This sort of fits into the creative coaching that I do, where I teach a lot of my students to have a system. A lot of times, you know, we think that organization and creativity can't function together, but I actually think that's wrong. I think we need spontaneity, but I also think we need organization. When your whole creative life is absolute chaos, it just doesn't work. And when you find yourself doing something over and over again, you realize you have to build a system. You get to the point where you're doing the work, and depending on what kind of artist you are, you will have outputs for this work. And if you do that enough, you'll realize you need a system. And I was like individually like taking an illustration, putting it onto an A5 leatherette notebook, and then how does that look on a keychain? And then I was like, no, wait, there needs to be a whole system. And so I now have a whole system that I now do the moment I finish an illustration. And I know that that illustration will then get reworked into multiple extended designs and all of that. And also part of my business, I have a licensing library where bigger brands and corporations can log in, see all the different kinds of illustrations I have and extended designs of that illustration, so that they're ready to license for their products. And I'm trying to make it as easy as possible for them. So this system has come out of like a need, but also I have found that my creativity and my business thrive with this whole structure I've built. You know, and I feel like if you're an illustrator and you're starting out, this kind of thing maybe people aren't talking about, or maybe I'm just unique and I needed this system for myself. But I sort of figure that surely if I share this stuff, it can be of help. I'm just trying to kind of like peel away the facade and the very finely polished curtain of it all, and show you a little bit of what I'm up to behind the scenes, which I think that's sort of what I'm going to try doing moving forward. As you can tell, there's not a lot of production value happening here. I've spent a long time thinking about how to make my YouTube videos pretty, all of my content pretty, and yes, there is a place for that, but I'd like for you to just hang out with me and just see what I'm up to without me having to worry about how good is the production value of what I'm trying to show you. Hopefully that means you get an insight into something that's a little bit more real, not as staged or over the top performative. So let's just hang out and see how I build this system and structure it, and I'll give you a little bit of, you know, a little bit of behind the scenes. Okay, let's go. First off, it's probably worth mentioning that I have transitioned to Affinity Studio. I still have Adobe. The plan is to eventually get rid of Adobe, and maybe I'm shooting myself in the foot here to never get sponsorship. But I truly have loved Affinity and what they're doing. I think their software is beautiful, and I love that it's all combined into one program. If you've got any questions about Affinity, feel free to drop them in the comments below. But this is a ram, like a merino sheep, that I've done previously, and I'll just have a little scroll through to show you what I've done. This is my original illustration. Here I was just kind of experimenting with some loose scribbles. It's very much a defining part of my style. So what I do is I then take that illustration and I give it multiple different kind of variations on transparent backgrounds. I will also create a line work version of the illustration as well, which isn't hard because in my original illustration, I keep all of my line work separate. I don't flatten or compress it. Eventually my goal is to do a coloring book with a lot of my artwork, or maybe work with someone to create a coloring book. So I always create a line work version of my illustration. I will have a basic kind of a version with my illustration and a chunky outline, either in white or in a color. And this would be a really great application for a keychain. I might just show you how this ended up as a keychain. I will often try like little swishes and scribbles with an illustration. I'll try some variations of some like painterly backgrounds, and there'll be a variation with just the illustration and a shadow as well. And the nice thing about Affinity is it's got some really powerful exporting abilities. Depending on how you structure your layers and your folders within your artboards, you know, you can have very clever ways of exporting a version with just a shadow and a background, or just the illustration as it was originally. It's worth really getting to know your tools in that sense. And then what I'll do is I'll put, each illustration will sort of get put into these, you know, kind of painterly backgrounds. So for example, this piece, this extended design is what I would call it, will end up being on a A5 leatherette journal. So that's what it would look like, you know, cropped down. And that's me just putting a little preview over the top to see how it would fit across an A5 leatherette journal. And so with this, you've got to keep in mind that your illustration has to sit to the right of that extended design. I will often then do kind of like a flipped version of that, where there's a left heavy version of that design. This might be like really great for a placemat. Here's a little bit more, a bit bigger. You know, the placemat might be circular or it might be rectangle. I haven't quite got to manufacturing those yet, but I'm kind of trying to future-proof all of my setups so that that might be ready to go when I am ready to do that. And this big one would probably be for a picnic blanket. So again, I'm currently setting everything up to send that to print. And the picnic blankets I'm thinking of will be like 1.5 meters by 1.5 with a beautiful leather kind of a belt handle thing that wraps around it. But this is sort of where you want your artwork centered and big and a big focal piece. Another thing I might do is I always get like I try to set up a repeatable pattern for, there might be scenarios where I might need to supply this repeated background. And I tend to use this like halftone pattern a lot. And then you can just put a PNG version of the illustration on top. And so the background and the transparent background illustration variation work well together that way. And, you know, one of the other things I set my artwork up for is a calendar. I've done in previous years. I didn't do one last year, but I think this year I should be able to do it. You know, because of the like dynamic exporting with Affinity, I can export different versions. So there would be a version of this with that white edge and without it. And even I could export different versions with and without the swish as well. So then that means I've got lots of different options for whether it's someone who wants to license it or for my own products. So this is just how you make things work for you and get the most bang for buck out of your own illustrations. So what I'm going to do now is open up my tiger illustration. I'll show you that, and then I'll show you how I build it out. Okay, so this is the original illustration I created. What I want to do is in a separate file, I'm going to move all of that across. I keep the original illustration separate to the file I set up with my variations, just because I don't ever want to lose that original illustration, and that'll be saved in quite a high resolution format, often at 600 DPI, whether that's in a native Affinity file or Photoshop file. So then I will bring it across to a file that's already set up, and I have a template file that I copy and paste, and then I start building out all of my extended designs and variations, and within that is an embedded file. Then I bring in the original illustration, and I've distilled it down to just the illustration. In the original version, it has a chunky outline, it has background, it has shadows, but that's fine. What I need is I need it distilled down to just the illustration, and then I build it all out in my artboards in the bigger file. So here he is, just kind of sitting on his own, no background, no chunky colored outline. And then that now will sit across sit in this file. And this is where I now get to put in my beautiful big chunky outlines and shadows. If you see how I've labeled everything here in the side panel, that then allows me to go to my slice persona and, you know, with a little bit of, it would then export each folder or group within this artboard. And if I've cleverly set a shadow and an outline in separate folders, then it sort of is this like dynamic exporting. So I'll just put up here on screen, you can see there's just the plain illustration, the illustration with the chunky outline, the illustration with the shadow, and hopefully a chunky outline and a shadow. So I've got that, I'm happy with that. I might then, I'll come back to my pixel persona here. I will now try to create a background, like a really painterly background. So it will still eventually have a transparent background, but there'll be like some painterly brush strokes around the edges. So that's what I'm going to do, and I'll build out a few other things as well. I'm happy with that for now. I might finesse that a little bit more, but you can kind of get the gist that we'll have a few different variations of a background here, but there'll be a version, small kind of pink background, a bigger pink background. And you know, these would be great for keychains, stickers, that kind of thing. So now I get to move on to my other extended designs, and yeah, follow along as I do that. Okay, that is now done. And with a little bit of editing magic, this is now that whole suite for the green tiger illustration. So this was our little hang with me sesh, something new I'm trying, and hopefully it's given you just an overview of how systems can work throughout your creative practice. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that creativity always has to be spontaneous and erratic. And yes, there's definitely times we need to just throw caution to the wind and lean into the chaos of being a creative human being. But especially if you're trying to develop your work for very specific outputs or build a business around your own creativity, you have to have systems. I just don't think you can function without them. And what will end up happening is you'll become very overwhelmed and very burnt out if you don't have the systems with which you execute your greater work. So that's just a little bit of an insight into my life as an artist, but also as a creative coach who has seen the ugly side of things when my students or myself don't implement these things, and then your whole creative life can come to a halt, and then you might even be dealing with creative block. Trust me, you don't want to be dealing with that, but if you can avoid it, avoid it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you found any of this helpful or whether you enjoyed just hanging out and seeing some behind the scenes. Anyway, that's all from me today. Stay happy, stay creative.